then. When Jerry was 12, he accompanied his mother on a week-long trip to France. Jerry's father was scheduled to go with them, but yet again, something came up at the last minute and he was forced to cancel. Jerry's father was the senior partner for one of the more prestigious law firms in the city. The man worked long hours, and since Jerry did not have any friends, he and his mother spent a lot of time in each other's company. They stayed in Paris, in a small hotel 3 blocks from the Champs-Élysées. Jerry's mother signed the register Mrs. Vanessa Polk, though her actual given name was Vera, and son Gerald, though nobody ever called him that. The hotel was unlike any Jerry had ever seen before, tall and thin like his mother. It looked fancy on the outside, but was quite shabby inside, with small dusty rooms, with cheap prints on the walls, and a tiny elevator about the size of those phone booths that disappeared with the advent of cell phones. Jerry's mother was in the habit of taking regular walks back in New York for the sake of her figure, so the two of them spent a good part of every day in Paris, traipsing from one art gallery or museum to another. When returning to the hotel one evening, they took a wrong turn and ended up on a street with once grand 3-story houses now gone to seed. There was a line of heavily made up women standing on the street, spaced at intervals of 20 feet or so apart. Jerry asked his mother if the women were all waiting for somebody. His mother's face turned pink, and she told him not to look at them. As they reached the end of the street, Jerry glanced back and happened to catch the eye of one of the women. She was red-haired and pretty, and she looked very young, perhaps only a few years older than Jerry himself. The girl wore her hair piled on top of her head in a bun, and Jerry noticed that she sported an unusual feature that either detracted from, or enhanced her appearance. He couldn't say which. An oval-shaped birthmark near the hairline on the right side of her forehead. The girl smiled at Jerry in a lopsided sort of way and shrugged as if to say, "I don't know what I'm doing here either." 39 years to the day had passed since the encounter with the girl on the street in Paris. The likeness of the girl was indelibly carved into the architecture of Jerry's brain. Axons, neurons, and synapses configured to the precise contours of body, face, most of all, that enigmatic smile. Jerry had always wondered about this, the girl's effect on him. Jerry was sitting in an armchair, sipping on a fine Pinot Noir he'd bought to mark the occasion. He picked up the photograph that he'd removed earlier in the day from the wall safe in the cellar. As always, Jerry's stomach started to churn as he looked at it. The photo had come to Jerry's attention with the death of his mother 5 years ago. It might have been forever consigned to obscurity, but for the refined tastes of a relative. Jerry was disposing of his mother's things as a way of keeping himself together. There was a collection of romance novels. Jerry had offered the novels to his cousin, who he thought would like them, only to be told that she doesn't read such trash. The photo fell out of a book named Charlotte's Viking, as Jerry was packing up the novels to ship to Goodwill. The photo was a close-up of Jerry's mother as a young woman, a drab, monochrome affair, probably snapped with one of those old box cameras that were in use at the time. Written on the back were the place and the date, Coney Island, July 25, 1947. The girl, who 8 years later was destined to become Jerry's mother, would have been 16 years old then. She was smiling sassily into the camera, the way young people want to do, pulling her hair back from her face and pointing to something on her forehead. Jerry couldn't be sure, since the photo was badly faded. It looked like an oval moon, identical in location to the one on the girl inside his head. There was a strong resemblance between the girl in the picture and the young streetwalker in Paris. high cheekbones, longish face, the way the left side of the face of the mouth curled upwards a little more than the right when she smiled, lending a touch of roguishness to the face. You might have thought the two were twins, though the age difference suggested a slightly different scenario. Jerry's mother hailed from a working class family from the east side of Boston. Jerry had never met any of them. Ties with that side of the family, having been well and truly severed before he was born, but he had researched something of the family history. Jerry's maternal grandparents, Frank and Margaret Byrne, had emigrated from Ireland between the two world wars, a few years prior to his mother's birth. As far as Jerry was aware, there were no relatives in France, and of course he knew nothing about the girl. But the paternal family grapevine had it that his mother had been a bit of a lass prior to her marriage, and one of the uncles was kind enough to pass on something he'd learned somehow concerning a hasty departure to Europe in her early 20s, following an alarming expansion in the midriff region. It couldn't all be coincidence. Looking at this picture, Jerry wondered if he'd ever really known his mother. The room was starting to grow dark with the setting sun. Jerry switched on a lamp and poured himself another glass of wine. This time of day was always the hardest to deal with now, the grey period between the time the markets closed on the West Coast and the night set in with its shroud of anonymity, the time of elephant men like himself and goblin women. Jerry took stock of his life. No romantic partner, no siblings, a few professional acquaintances, none that he would call friends. He pulled the letter out of his wallet and examined it for the umpteenth time. Picard et associé détectives efficaces et discrets, 127 Rue Saint-Martin, 72001, Paris, France, 29 April 2005. Dear Monsieur, we thank you for your inquiry. Efficace et discrète. Would they be able to find her? As the tone of this letter implied, the very idea was fantastic. Then again, what if they did? Jerry had led a sheltered life, but he knew enough about the ways of the world to know that things rarely turned out well for women who sold themselves. Jerry was by nature a generous man, the type of generosity that wrote yearly checks to organizations with names like World Outreach, the New England Psychiatric Foundation, Battered Wives of America. How would it feel to look poverty in the face, sickness, misery and pain, madness even, assuming she was even still alive? And what was there to say? I saw you once on the street, madame. You were young and pretty then. It was time to start thinking about dinner, though Jerry was barely hungry. There was a steak in the freezer that he could defrost. Perhaps I'll fry up a potato in honor of the occasion, Jerry thought with a wry smile. Reference to French fries, by the way. Fact was, he never ate anything fried these days, not since his doctor had found a cholesterol problem. Better safe than sorry. They'll inscribe that on my tombstone, Jerry thought bitterly. Jerry crumpled up the letter and tossed it into the wastebasket. He cast a final glance at the photo and placed it in an envelope. At midnight, he'd take the photo down to the cellar and lock it back in the safe, where it would remain untouched until this time next year. Next year would be the 40th. Perhaps he'd treat himself to a bottle of Dom Perignon. Jerry was seized by a sudden spell of coughing. His chest felt like a vice. He fell back in the chair as the sharp pain seized his upper body and pulled down his left arm. Was he having a heart attack? The room had suddenly become very bright. The two women were standing there. Both looked exactly as Jerry remembered them that day on the street in Paris. His mother tall and proud, the girl bemused. His mother was pointedly ignoring him, pulling back the girl's hair and tenderly stroking the birthmark. See how beautiful, she murmured, to no one in particular. But the girl wasn't looking at Jerry's mother. She was pointing at Jerry, as though she intended to help him, or at least draw attention to his plight. Instead, she smiled that mischievous smile, his mother's smile. Look what you raised, she said. Jerry would not be treated this way in his own home by a dead woman and a trollop. He opened his mouth to tell them as much, but all he could do was gasp. I'm going to die, his mind screamed as blackness washed over him. Just after dawn, Jerry opened his eyes. The pain in his chest had subsided and the women were gone. Everything looked the same, but it felt like something in the room had shifted. After a while, Jerry got up and walked over to the trash can. He fished up the ball of paper and straightened it out. The letter felt like a lead weight in his hand. A doorway to another world, or a dead end, or the proverbial road to hell. Jerry sat down at the desk and reached for pen and paper. Dear Monsieur Picard,